Welcome to another episode of SJS Recommends. Today we are going to talk about Let My Children Hear Music from the great Charles Mingus, one of the great jazz artists of the 20th century, and also a personal favorite for me, definitely my top 3 jazz artists. I've listened to many of his albums, and this is one of my favorite ones. But I'll give some background info and things like that before we get into the discussion. So this was recorded in 1971, but it was released in 1972. And it's about an hour long. It was released by the Columbia label, which is obviously a big jazz label. And this album is kind of part of the third stream genre, which is a genre that mixes jazz and Western classical music together, but then this also has like avant-garde jazz elements, and then it has that kind of experimental big band element there too. But I'll go through the personnel. This actually has lots of people working on it, so this list will take quite a while to go through. But so we have Charles Mingus on bass, piano, and as the composer, and he also again worked on the arrangements and orchestration, and he even read some poetry in one of the tracks. Then we have Theo Macero in alto saxophone and as a producer and conductor. Then we have Snooky Young on the trumpet, and also on trumpet we have many others like Lonnie Hillier, Jimmy Nottingham, Ernie Royal, Marvin Stamm, Joe Wilder, Alder Rizzi. Then on cello we have Charles McCracken. On alto saxophone we have Charles McPherson. Then on tenor saxophone we have Chase Moody, and he also plays the flute. Then Bobby Jones on clarinet and tenor saxophone, Jimmy Knepper on trombone, Eddie Bird on trombone, Warren Covington on trombone, Julius Watkins on French horn, Brooks Tillotson on French horn, Jim Puffington on French horn, such a huge list. Earl Chaffin on French horn, Paul Ingraham on French horn, Jack Jennings on tuba, Howard Johnson on tuba and flugelhorn, Bob Stewart on tuba, Jerry Dodgion on alto saxophone and flute. Still going. Harvey Estrin on saxophone, Danny Fank on baritone saxophone, Hubert Laws on flute, Joe Temperley on baritone saxophone, Albert Regney on saxophone, Romeo Benque on flute, Seymour Press on saxophone, George Marchi on flute and reeds, Ray Beckenstein on saxophone. Like how can there be so many? Daniel Trimfoley on saxophone, Hank Freeman on saxophone, Wallace Shapiro on reeds, Hal McCusick on alto saxophone, tenor saxophone, baritone saxophone, John Leone on saxophone, Sir Roland Hanna, piano, John Foster piano, Patty Pound, piano, Paki Pizzarelli, guitar, and Homer Mensch double bass, Kenneth Fricker double bass, Francis Tavares double bass, Ron Carter bass, Richard Davis bass, Herb Butler bass, not too many left. Milt Hinton on bass, Tony Brown drums, Danny Richmond drums, Warren Smith drums and other percussion, Bill Krause on percussion, Stan Tonkel on engineering, Russ Payne on engineering, Ed Lee cover art design, David Carr photography, Sue Johnson as arranger, orchestration, conductor, and Alan Raff with orchestration and conductor. So that was the huge list. So it truly is a big band.
That's quite an endeavor that you chose to read all those out.
Yeah. But some other info. So Mingus actually, when this album came out, said that he thinks that it's his best album that he ever made. And then in the Rolling Stone Jazz Record Guide, which is a very famous guide for jazz music, it has this as a 5-star album, and then also All Music has it as a 5-star album. But actually, when I was reading about this album a bit, like other people's reviews and stuff, many people called this album underrated. And I actually hadn't kind of noticed that myself that it is underrated, because I'm so kind of, my perspective is so much kind of dictated by Rate Your Music, because I'm so addicted to that website. Because on Rate Your Music, it's actually a very highly rated album. It has like a very high average rating, and it's one of his highest rated albums there. But then when I looked up the album through other websites and through other people's opinions, many people said that it's not usually ranked as one of his highest albums. So I think the Rate Your Music user base, for some reason, absolutely love this album, but then many other people maybe don't rate it as highly in the general conversation, which is very interesting. And Mingus was, of course, one of the very important figures in the third stream genre, again, that mixes jazz and classical music. Obviously, that's a genre that I haven't heard that many albums of that genre, and I don't think it's that popular of a genre. I think there are many other jazz-related genres that are way more popular and have way more artists doing that type of music than third stream. But from what I've read, I think Charles Mingus actually, when he was a kid and a younger musician, he was kind of into classical music and thinking of maybe doing a career in classical music, but then he ended up in jazz. And of course, we know that jazz is like art form that's mainly like dominated by people of color, you could say, but then classical music is a very wide genre. So I think the fact that he didn't go into classical music might have been due to like racism, that at that time maybe black people weren't accepted into doing classical music. And I know Mingus was very outspoken about racism and civil rights and things about like that during his life. So I think, yeah, there's that kind of conflict there, but then he got to kind of explore, you could say, classical composition in a way later on with these albums where he mixed jazz instrumentation and classical playing. And we can in a bit talk more about like how we see like classical music in this type of music. Like I have some things to say about it, even though again I don't know like music theory or jazz theory or things like that, so it will be a very vulgar way of describing that, but I'll do my best. And yeah, but yeah, I think this might have been actually the first Mingus album that I heard. I think I was kind of attracted to the cover of the album actually, and I thought that it looked cool, so I wanted to listen to this. And I think at that point I was listening to lots of 70s jazz. This was like a couple of years ago when my jazz knowledge was way worse than it is now. But I think these days the Black Saint and the Sinner Lady that came out in the 63 is usually thought of as Mingus's masterpiece, and that's probably maybe my number one as well. It's an incredible album, and I often say that that might be the greatest jazz album ever made. It's an incredible album, but I think this album is almost as good. And of course, there are albums like Mingus Aham, which is like one of the cornerstones of 50s jazz. It's an incredible album as well, and that's probably usually like rated there with Black Saint and the Sinner Lady as one of his best. Then he did this album called Blues and Roots. I think it came out between Mingus Aham and Black Saint and Sinner Lady. That's a masterpiece of an album. Then there's this album called Tijuana Moods, which I really enjoy. That's like a very interesting album. And one thing I'll say generally about Mingus before we get into the discussion, that I always think that his albums, while they are very dense musically, very layered musically, very complex and interesting musically, but I always think that he doesn't take himself that seriously in the music, that there's always this like fun element and little quirky element in the music, that it always sounds like the musicians are having lots of fun, even though I think I've also heard that Mingus was like really tough, like a band leader, so he was like very controlling and stuff, but you don't really hear that in the music, as it just flows very beautifully and it just sounds like fun, I think. But yeah, now I'm gonna ask Altaz what he thought of this beautiful, interesting album.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I just want to show this is the cover. As Jay's talking about, very interesting cover. I see almost like a tribal sculpture-esque in the background. Then you got these geometric shapes and kind of like astronomy, kind of trying to measure, like, I guess, so you have kind of like the mathematics there, but what it forms is actually a face, and then you see a tree in there. And so it's a very interesting and engaging cover, and it makes you think about what it also has to do with the the music. There's a rainbow and stuff in there. So I think that'll be interesting when you talk about classic and stuff, and what it's saying about maybe structures and improvisation and all that stuff. The back is just a picture of him there. And I've also seen Charles Mingus. If you want to see him in a film, there's a Basil Dearden film called All Night Long, and he's in that film, and he does a set and everything. So check that out, and I've done a video on that as well. It's a Shakespeare adaptation, that film. So if you're interested, I have that video. And what did I think about the album? I mean, it's masterwork. It's incredible. Again, I don't know. Recently, I've gotten really obsessed with titles. Before, I didn't used to pay too much attention to titles, but I was like, okay, let my children hear music. What does it mean? Because it seemed to me like a very protest statement. Because if you're coming from, okay, the black race, but any other kind of race as well, legacy in a way becomes important because you are trying to progress their experience, so you want their experience to be better than yours. Clearly, he thinks an important part of that is his children being able to hear music, and it becomes a very political statement. And I think that that's very interesting when you listen to the album, because like you said, on the first half, on the first side, the music is there's playful elements. So you have instruments really mimicking almost animal sounds, like elephants and other kind of sounds of like nature. So I could see the playfulness, like it's almost like, let my children hear music everywhere, meaning let them be inspired, let their mind be free, let them see the music of nature, that nature is actually musical. You just need to be able to see it that way. So it's about opening perceptions. But on the other side, it starts going into very darker, heavier themes. I wouldn't say darker, I'll say heavier themes. Hobo Ho, the chill of death, which is where he does the poetry, and then the eye of the Hurricane Sue. And I think that, yeah, this is amazing, because it's like through the music, it's almost like feeding the children from a young age to when they need to also be introduced to the realities of the world, the challenges, the constraints, the problems, the forces, and all those things are like kind of being communicated through the music. I'm kind of starting there. I know these are themes because I have trouble, like we discussed before. I don't know how to talk about jazz music exactly because I'm not trained or know enough how to talk about the music itself. But I think it's an incredible album to listen to and be taken in this journey, while also thinking about what Charles Mingus is trying to communicate through his work.
Yeah, I'm really glad you like the album, and I'm gonna add to what you said about the title of the album a bit, because I remember like interview with Mingus about this album where I think he talked about the title a little bit, and he was talking about kind of the state of music around the time when he was like recording that album and composing and stuff, and he wasn't kind of happy with certain elements of the contemporary music of that time. So you could imagine the title like "Let My Children Hear Real Music" if they added that well. Mm-hmm. So he wanted to kind of create what he thought of was like good music, or something that maybe people should hear instead of the music of the popular music of that time. But again, people don't quote me on that, as I just have a vague memory of that. But we could also now talk about the music itself. So I think where we can hear the kind of classical elements is the dynamics on this music, how it has these ebbs and flows and peaks and valleys, where we have these very chill moments at times, but then it has these big explosions at certain moments that we hear in the classical music in too. Like when you listen to a symphony, you have these, like sometimes these huge climaxes and huge, like very dramatic moments, but then you have moments where you just hear like simple piano and some strings, and not that much is happening. So like how these tracks flow from start to finish, I think that's where we can really hear the classical music, and also how kind of there are so many different instruments and how they play together and how each one has a particular role. I think that's also kind of similar to what we hear in classical music, and this also like just has those similar type of emotion as classical music. That it has those kind of whimsical elements, it has that dramatic element, but those fun quirky elements as well. So it mixes different elements together really well and different moods together really well. And I think also going back to jazz, we also hear lots of elements of different types of jazz. So there are even moments where it gets like really intense, when it sounds like almost like free jazz, even though obviously it's not free jazz because it's composed. So it's different than free jazz, but it sounds very much like free jazz. And of course, with Mingus, we often have the avant-garde jazz tag, and he was one of the very important names with that. And again, the album that I mentioned, The Black Saint and the Sinner Lady, is one of the best avant-garde jazz albums of all time. And of course, these weirder styles of jazz kind of started in the late 50s when we had, for example, the Ornette Coleman album, The Shape of Jazz to Come, which is pretty much like the first free jazz album, and that really kind of revolutionized the genre a lot. So we have the roots of these types of different types of jazz a lot in the late 50s, the second half of the 50s, and then, but it was then kind of more perfected in the 60s, and then in the 70s, especially in the first half of the 70s, these jazz artists did lots of even more like experimentation and tried to take the sound into different realms, like we see with Miles Davis and Pitches Brew, one of his famous albums, and we see the jazz fusion movement at that time, and lots of different types of jazz artists like Sandra, who was like really nutty but very interesting at the same time. So 70s is actually like one of my favorite eras of jazz because it has many of these different styles, and everybody is willing to try something different and try to innovate. I know some of the jazz purists don't like that because they really love the earlier stuff, and they don't like when jazz tries to go into different waters. But I, as a fan of all types of jazz, really love this.
Yeah, I think like two things kind of struck me as you were talking. Yeah, one was on the theme when him said, "Let my children hear real music." I definitely agree with that. I did see that imposition of real in there, and it's like it is political because if you say you're in the 70s and if you see the state of music, okay, obviously there's a pretty set music industry and all that kind of stuff. It's really about creativity is a way of freeing minds, or music as a way of freeing minds, as we also discussed in Tarkovsky's Stalker. He's talking about the power of music and the power of music to create a free mind. So real music would be the kind of music that frees your mind. The other kind of music, in a way, is not really music and is a way of creating a colonized and controlled mind. I do somehow sense that in there through every song. I feel that anti-establishment, almost protest message, which also amazes me because I always used to think that that kind of stuff has to be conveyed through song, actual lyrics. But listening to music without lyrics and still feeling essences and messages blows my mind and helps me understand exactly what the album is teaching. What happens when you hear real music. And then now I also like all the things you're saying about the songs itself, because in some ways it's like encapsulating some of the history of jazz. You see the big band element, like almost like the Duke Ellington type, very kind of big band elements, very structured, like kind of almost pre-composed, preset aspect, and then there's a real nice swing in most of the tracks, or some of the tracks, especially on the first side, a lot of swing. um, so it's very danceable. It gets your body active. You're feeling um, that vibe, but then at the same time there is improvisation. But what's interesting about the improvisation here is that I feel it goes with, I believe, what Charles Mingus's belief was, that improvisation is a form of composition. And again, it goes back to structures which you are mentioning, and racial structures, because it was at jazz was not being accepted as a great art form like classical, or exactly the same form or a new version of that form. It was seen as lesser because of the improvisations. But Charles Mingus's thesis was that improvisation is composing in the moment, and which makes sense because a Mozart sat at the piano and he played around and he composed, but and then he thought about it and he wrote. But this is happening on the spot, so in a way, it is a very, you get, the audience gets to see composition in real life as it's being expressed out of the minds of the artist. So it's like you said, it has really nice kind of structure in a way of like preset composition, like of classical music, and then there are these flourishes, and then on top of that there's the playfulness. It's not taking itself too seriously by making these mimicking sounds of animals and all that kind of stuff. It's an instrument is both to move you, both to bring joy, but to bring entertainment, to bring fun. So he's not trying to say, because I'm trying to do these things, that I'm not going to make it danceable. Because even when Mozart was composing, he was hoping people could dance to it too sometimes. So um, those are kind of the two things that kind of came to my mind as you were talking.
Yeah, it is indeed very danceable, and I think that's true for all of Mingus's music that I've heard. That, like I said, there's this fun and quirky element that adds to that danceable element. But to add to a couple of the things that you were saying, yeah, jazz is, even though maybe people don't realize it anymore, but it's protest type of music. Many of these albums have as the background like the civil rights movement and things like that. And of course, like one of my favorite jazz albums is by Max Roach, for example, and I think his name is like something like "We Insist, Freedom Now" Suite. So you see even some of these titles that there is that political element, that human rights, civil rights element there. And then you mentioned Duke Ellington, and I think Duke Ellington was actually Mingus's like #1 influence. So it's no wonder why you would think of Duke Ellington, because he was like a major influence to Charles Mingus. And I think I read somewhere that his two main influences were Duke Ellington and church. So just the church and church music and things like that. And then Duke Ellington, obviously, in his music mixes like classical music and jazz as well. Like my favorite Duke Ellington album is called Far East Suite from the early 60s. I absolutely love that record, and it's kind of like Mingus takes elements from other forms of music. Like, again, it says Far East, so it takes lots of Eastern elements to and adds that to
That's
jazz.
nice. Yeah.
And that's like a amazing album that, yeah, I really love that one. So yeah, I definitely can see how Duke Ellington and Mingus are both these like very interesting, varied and daring artists, and I can see why Mingus felt such a connection to Duke Ellington.
Yeah, I definitely see that. I mean, a Duke Ellington favorite for me is the Nutcracker Suites, where he takes Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker and reinterprets it, and I love it as much as the original Nutcracker. And I feel it like it's hard to say like it's all on par. So you see the genius of both, even though he's adapting. It's amazing. But yes, I saw that in the second track, especially Adagio ma non troppo, the arabesque elements, the Eastern, the exotic sounds bringing in. And of course, I think about the power of that too, because when someone is listening to that, and let's say they're sitting there in kind of these urban areas, like in a Chicago or something like that, and they don't really get to travel, they go to how you can explore lands through music, because he's bringing the sounds of that land, the very like Arabian sounds, and it also makes me wonder about how that they were absolute geniuses, right? Because they learned all different kinds of musical styles, and they knew how to bring it into the composition of jazz in this beautiful way. And so, yeah, the touch of the exotic, which also Duke Ellington brought into the Nutcracker suites. That's really exciting to learn, actually, and I can see even more. And the chill of death is the one that really, now you're having all this fun, and then there's the poem, and very introspective, the chill of death, very very haunting, very yeah, like very introspective, very touching as well. What do you think of the chill of death?
Yeah, it's an incredible track, and I maybe some ways like the second half of the album even more. I think it gets a bit more experimental in the second half, and a bit more insane. I think there I also hear some of the free jazz element, even though it's not free jazz, like I said. And to go back to also that genre bending, obviously Mingus also took lots of influence, not as much in this album, but from like Latin music and flamenco and things like that. And obviously that's very understandable when lots of like people from Latin America, for example, were migrating to the US and things. So it's kind of bound to happen that you would take some influence from that. And that's one element I also like in Mingus's music, as I'm a big fan of Latin music of various kinds, whether it's samba or flamenco or more popular forms of Latin music. Yeah, I really like that. Yeah.
Yeah, there are all those elements there, you're right. And it's the way he brings it together. But then in a way, he's trying to give it, I can't think of another word, that's authenticity, because I don't think that from his standpoint, he doesn't think his music's authentic, but he's trying to, in a way, give it that recognition it deserves as being part of classical music, that jazz music. And this album actually made me feel that. I was like, why do we look at them as two separate things? Because the people composing and creating it, it's the same kind of greatness, and in a way a same kind of approach as well. So
yeah, and I don't really get why you would have to like be a jazz fan and hate classical, or be a classical fan and hate jazz, because I absolutely love both and wouldn't want to live without either. So, and I think it's very enriching when you listen to both, whether again Chopin, Schubert, Beethoven, and then you can listen to Coltrane, Miles Davis, and Mingus, and I get lots of happiness from both types of music. So
yeah, and they both have the similar effect on me when I think about myself mentally and emotionally, and that's why I was like, I didn't really think about it, because we always get caught up in the genre name and title and all that. But having an album like this, and learning about all these things, like you said, about him being interested in composition and his own thoughts on composition and stuff like that, and jazz being a form of composition in real time as well, all of a sudden kind of created that paradigm shift in my head too. I was like, yeah, okay, and these both genres have this very these both styles of music, they have this similar impact on me, and so they're one and the same thing. They're not actually different.
Yeah. And I would say more generally to people that it is really worth it to check out like many Mingus albums, because many people, I think, they stop after they've listened to Mingus, and the Black Saint and the Sinner Lady, and then they don't listen to other albums, but I would highly recommend like doing a deep dive. I mean, I still have many of them myself to listen to, because obviously many of these jazz artists made so many records that it's hard to go through all of them. But every single one that I've listened to have been like 5-star albums. So that's why I absolutely adore Mingus, as he just made so much great music and very fun music, and it's very dense music, but not in an intimidating way, but in a beautiful way that you always love going back to his stuff. And yeah, I hope that he will be that people will continue to celebrate his work, as I think he stands there up in the Mount Rushmore with the Coltrane's and the Miles Davises of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just the way the first track opens, there's just a feeling, an elation. It's unbelievable. So yeah, I really like, as I listen to Charles Mingus too. He's high in my estimation, whatever that means. But for me, I enjoy him a lot, and
And of course, in the future, future of the podcast, we will do many of the artists that I just mentioned. Like for this year, we have lined up John Coltrane's Ascension, which is one of his famous albums. So that will be great to talk about. It's a masterpiece. Then I also lined up my favorite Ornette Coleman album, which is slightly underrated, I would say, Science Fiction, which actually I think it's from the same year as this one, and more weird jazz music there. And then, of course, next time, I didn't mention this artist, but next time we will also have jazz. So it's Crystals by Sam Rivers, which is also like, it's free jazz and also has a bit of that experimental big band element there as well. So that will be interesting. And he's not as famous as Mingus, but I think that's a very good album as well.
Yeah, I'm excited to listen to that one. Yeah.
And that one actually has a pretty nice cover as well. So it's like a crystal.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, with the fragments. I saw that when you showed that in your video. Yeah. And the fragments, and very, very wonderful cover.
And that's also from the 70s. I think that's from 74, so a couple of years after this. So,
yeah, it's broadening my knowledge too, that you're picking ones from the 70s, because jazz sometimes you get kind of associated from 40s, 50s, and maybe even 60s, and then you don't think about how jazz continued on. So it's nice to hear this stuff from the 70s.
Yeah, I've listened quite a lot from like Miles Davis kind of blew up to like the 70s. So so nice. late 70s to late 50s to mid 70s basically. So then after that, I think it started going downhill, unfortunately. But there are obviously still some good artists out there.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, was a very interesting discussion. I'm glad you liked the album, and I always love to champion Mingus as much as possible, as I'm a big fan. Like I said, probably might be in my like top 10 music artists of all time, like no matter what the genre is.
Oh wow, yeah.
So yeah, we can end here. So let us know what you think of this album if you have heard it, and you can let us know what you think of Mingus in general or jazz in general. I know it's not very, or it's not seen as a very accessible genre these days, and it's a very niche genre these days, even though it used to be for the masses. But these days it's seen as like you have your expensive turntable and expensive whiskey, and you look down from your ivory tower for some reason. It's like we've talked about, like Shakespeare was popular, but now he's seen as an elite, and same with Charles Dickens and many of these authors that did something for the masses, but now it's like really highbrow. And it's really weird how that perception changes. But
yeah, it becomes elitist. Yeah.
I think part of it is that most people don't like instrumental music, no matter what it is, that most people need a voice to connect to the music. But
yeah, exactly. It's definitions changing and all that, yeah.
But yeah, we might do some vocal jazz on this podcast some days too, as I like Nina Simone, for example.
And we also forget that even in these time periods, 60s, 70s, and this, you know, the rock movement with all this great like rock music coming up, but they were listening to jazz for inspiration. They were very much inspired by this jazz, and they were very much incorporating elements or homaging elements of this into that music. So yeah, it wasn't meant to be elite. Always, even classical music wasn't to be accessible. It's the systems that make things elite and not elite.
Yeah. And I think Mingus was also very much influenced by blues. And okay, like one of his records is even called Blues and Roots, like I said. So, and obviously blues really influenced lots of the rock bands, like obviously Led Zeppelin ripped off lots of the blues stuff for their early stuff. But yeah. Anyway, yeah, another great set of recommendations, and looking forward to more stuff in the future. And yeah, thanks for watching. Don't drink Coke at all. Sayonara and arigato gozaimashita.